They weren't the ones storming trenches or rolling through villages in tanks. They were the ones who came after. In the wake of the German army's advance, another force followed, operating in the shadows with a different kind of mission. Numbering in the tens of thousands, these were Hitler's secret enforcers, the SS security formations. From the Ordnungspolizei and Sicherheitsdienst to the dreaded Gestapo and Einsatzgruppen, these units formed a vast and complex network of police, intelligence and paramilitary operatives. Their task was clear: secure the rear, hunt down partisans, eliminate political threats, and enforce a new law. While the Wehrmacht fought conventional battles at the front, these men waged a quieter, darker war, one of surveillance and control. In this video, we delve into the operations of the SS Police Division and the wider security apparatus of the Third Reich, exposing how they functioned, what roles they played, and the impact they left behind in the blood-soaked soil of Europe. Hitler's Germany was infamous not only for its military discipline and ideology, but also for the cold, calculated efficiency with which it enforced control. Nowhere was this more evident than in the intricate web of its police and security forces. The Nazi regime maintained a wide array of military and paramilitary police units, each with its own role and area of operation. On the front lines and in the rear, the Feljond Darmarie acted as the standard military police, easily recognizable by their iconic gorget necklaces. Alongside them was the Geheime Feldpolizei, or secret field police, responsible for counterintelligence, tracking deserters, and uncovering resistance movements. There was also the Streifendienst, which patrolled railway stations and ensured soldiers were not shirking their duties, and the Marine-Küstenpolizei, the naval coastal police charged with protecting key harbours and coastal facilities. Beyond these military units, the Nazi state deployed an even more feared apparatus of terror and surveillance. Organisations like the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and of course the SS operated with brutal efficiency. While some of these bodies were rooted in Germany's domestic structure, many were also unleashed across the occupied territories and even within combat zones. Their job: to suppress uprisings, root out dissent, and ensure that control extended into every corner of Europe by any means necessary. Together, these forces formed a chilling network of enforcement, military precision blended with ideological fanaticism. Whether behind the lines or in the heart of occupied cities, their presence reminded everyone the Reich's grip was tight, and its enemies had nowhere to hide. The roots of Germany's military police didn't begin with the Wehrmacht. It all started with the decentralized state police forces of the early 1930s. Back then, Germany's law enforcement landscape was fragmented, with various state-run police battalions operating almost like small paramilitary forces. These battalions weren't just local enforcers. They were well organized, uniformed, and already structured in a way that could easily be absorbed into a larger national military framework. When the Nazis came to power, they wasted no time. These state battalions were swiftly reorganized and brought under central control, giving the regime a ready-made pool of disciplined personnel. This move allowed for the rapid expansion of both the regular army and its associated military police forces. It was an efficient power grab cloaked in the guise of national unification. By January 1934, the process of centralization went into overdrive. The regime began merging these regional police into a single national force, the Landespolizei, and with that came a major shift in authority. Police powers were now transferred from state governments directly to Berlin. To oversee this growing empire of internal control, the Nazis created a new role, Chief of the German Police within the Ministry of the Interior. The man appointed to this position was none other than Heinrich Himmler, already the head of the SS. This appointment marked a dangerous fusion of police authority and ideological terror. From this point on, the distinction between regular policing and SS operations became increasingly blurred. In 1938, a new layer of command was introduced, the position of SS and police leader, or SS und Polizeiführer. These officials were placed across different geographical regions, acting as the supreme authority over every SS and police unit within their jurisdiction. Their chain of command bypassed traditional military structures. They reported directly to Himmler and ultimately to Adolf Hitler himself. This structure gave the Nazis a new level of centralized control. Whether in peacetime or in war, these leaders had the power to coordinate police raids, deportations, and mass executions, no questions asked, and no interference allowed. Among all of Germany's military police formations during the Second World War, none were as visible or as feared as the Feljond Armory, the regular military police of the Wehrmacht, nicknamed the Chain Dogs because of the metal gorgets they wore around their necks. These men were far more than traffic controllers or uniformed guards. While the Feljond Armory did handle traditional duties like managing military traffic, investigating crimes, and overseeing checkpoints, their role expanded dramatically in occupied territories. Once behind enemy lines or inside conquered cities, they were often tasked with far grimmer responsibilities, monitoring civilian populations, quelling resistance, rooting out partisans, and in many cases, executing them without hesitation. They became an extension of the new authority, enforcing new order. But getting into the Feljond Armory was no simple task. Candidates had to pass through rigorous training programs at specialized military police schools. There, they studied an extensive curriculum that went far beyond the battlefield. Recruits were taught criminal law, police powers, industrial codes, traffic regulations, and even topics like forestry, fishery, and waterway enforcement. Their responsibilities could include anything from inspecting factories to interrogating civilians. They also studied first aid, animal protection, air defense, folk customs, and techniques in self-defense and arrest procedures. They were trained in firearms, military drills, and the methodologies of criminal investigations. Typing and stenography, critical for handling endless reports and documentation, were also part of their education. The range of subjects was immense, reflecting the dual nature of their role, part soldier, part police enforcer. Even after the classroom, recruits weren't guaranteed a spot. They had to serve a practical internship at a police station, where they were evaluated for their ability to handle real-world situations. The dropout rate was steep. Out of one group of 219 trainees, only 89 reached the final exam. The standards were deliberately high, creating a corps that was elite, disciplined, and loyal. Many of those accepted into the Feljond Armory had previously served as civilian policemen. When drafted into military service, their previous rank and experience often translated directly into military status. These weren't raw recruits. They were experienced officers in uniform, now operating with the full authority of the army. Feljond Armory personnel were given complete infantry training, meaning they could fight alongside front-line troops if needed. But their real power came from the authority they carried. They were embedded within army divisions, corps and field armies, functioning as both enforcers and watchdogs. Each field army in the Wehrmacht had its own Feljond Armory battalion, while each individual division had a smaller Feljond Armory troop, a detachment tailored to that unit's needs. A standard Feljond Armory battalion included a headquarters element with one officer, one warrant officer, 2 non-commissioned officers, and several enlisted men, supported by 3 full platoons. Each platoon had its own commanding officer, a team of drivers, and around 30 men in total. A typical Feljond Armory troop, the unit attached directly to an infantry or panzer division, was composed of 3 officers, over 40 non-commissioned officers, and about 20 enlisted men. These small but powerful detachments acted as the eyes and ears of the High Command, capable of enforcing military law, directing battlefield logistics, or carrying out brutal reprisals behind the front lines. To many Wehrmacht soldiers, the sight of Feljond Armory troops approaching could mean trouble. Their presence signaled that discipline was being enforced, and that desertion, disobedience, or defiance would not be tolerated. When it came to arming the Feljond Armory, the German military police were equipped with a specific set of weapons tailored to their unique duties. Unlike standard infantrymen, who commonly carried the iconic Luger P08 or the Walther P38, military policemen often carried Walther pistols that were originally designed for civilian police use, specifically the Walther PP, Polizeipistole, and the more compact PPK. These sleek, reliable sidearms became especially favoured by officers for their ease of use, discreet profile, and solid performance in both field and urban settings. Non-commissioned officers typically carried machine pistols, offering greater firepower when patrolling volatile areas or setting up roadblocks. While the Mauser Karabiner 98K rifle, the standard-issue German bolt-action rifle, was also available to Feljond Armory units, it was not commonly used due to its bulk and slower rate of fire, which made it less practical for the fast-paced, high-control environment in which military police operated. For heavier firepower, especially when securing routes or holding defensive positions, the Feljond Armory turned to some of the Wehrmacht's deadliest tools, the MG-34 and the infamous MG-42 machine guns. These were often mounted on vehicles and used to guard key checkpoints or reinforce roadblocks. If things turned hostile, the military police could quickly turn from law enforcers into a lethal combat unit. What truly set the Feljond Armory apart, however, was not just their equipment, but the authority they wielded. They had the legal and military right to bypass checkpoints, move freely through secured areas, and inspect any location or convoy as they saw fit. They could conduct body searches, inspect property, and requisition help from any other soldier or civilian, regardless of that person's branch or posting. Even more notably, they held seniority over all other soldiers of the same rank, regardless of their unit. This meant that a Feljond Armory corporal, for example, could give direct orders to another corporal in the Luftwaffe, Heer, or Kriegsmarine, and expect immediate compliance. Their badge of authority wasn't just symbolic, it was a functional pass into any area of the war machine. In the aftermath of combat, when regular forces pushed forward, the Feljond Armory often remained behind. Their duties now shifted. They served as temporary town police, restoring order in newly captured or abandoned areas. They rounded up enemy stragglers hiding in the ruins, hunted down partisans and guerrillas, processed refugees and prisoners of war, and ensured that any captured valuables, whether weapons, food supplies, or military equipment, were properly secured. They enforced disarmament of the civilian population, organized forced labor, and began the administrative transformation of the area into an extension of the Nazi-controlled zone. They even erected military road signs and civilian direction markers, setting the stage for occupation and control. The presence of the Feljond Armory meant that the iron grip of the Reich had arrived. They were both feared and obeyed, enforcers of law, wielders of power, and instruments of terror rolled into one. Whether on the battlefield or behind the lines, they were never just passing through. They were watching, judging, and ready to act. Members of the Feljond Armory weren't confined to a single role or region. These military police served on every front, whether it was the windswept coasts of Western Europe, the brutal Eastern Front, or the unforgiving mountains of the Balkans. As the war dragged on and Germany's military fortunes began to crumble, their responsibilities evolved and grew darker. By the final phase of the conflict, the Feljond Armory were no longer just enforcing discipline behind the lines. Increasingly, they were thrust into frontline combat roles, often participating in desperate last-stand operations as Germany ran out of troops. Many of these men fought with bravery and resolve, and some were even awarded military honours for acts of courage under fire. But their dual reputation, both as enforcers and fighters, also made them prime targets. As the Red Army surged into German-held territory during the last months of the war, Soviet troops were reportedly offered rewards and bounties for capturing Feljond Armory personnel who were seen as symbols of Nazi oppression. Those unlucky enough to fall into Soviet hands could often expect no mercy. Many were executed on the spot. Aware of this grim fate, some Feljond Armory carried a second sold book or military pay book, along with matching identification tags, in an attempt to disguise themselves as regular infantrymen if captured. But perhaps their most controversial and feared role came during these chaotic final months. As the Wehrmacht began to fall apart and mass desertions increased, the Feljond Armory were placed in charge of stopping the flood of Fahnenflüchtiger, deserters, literally translated as runners from the flag. These soldiers, many of whom were young, wounded, or simply hopeless, faced swift and brutal consequences if caught. Summary executions became common, carried out without trial as a show of force and an attempt to stem the collapse of discipline. By this point, public morale was shattered. Support for the war was fading fast. Civilians and even soldiers viewed the Feljond Armory with growing resentment. Among the population, they earned a grim nickname, Heldenklau, or hero snatchers. Their job now involved combing through crowds of refugees, searching trains, and patrolling the rear areas to hunt down potential deserters and send reluctant or wounded men back to the front lines. Despite their feared authority, they were still part of the regular German army and wore its standard field grey uniform. But the Feljond Armory could be easily recognized by distinctive details. Their uniforms featured orange-red piping visible on the crown and band of their peaked caps, the Schirmmütze. This same colour was used in the centre bars of the collar patches and on the shoulder boards of both enlisted men and non-commissioned officers. For officers, the orange-red appeared as the underlay beneath their shoulder straps. Their left sleeves bore a unique policy-style eagle insignia, an embroidered eagle and swastika encircled by a wreath of oak leaves. For enlisted men and NCOs, the insignia was stitched in orange-red thread. For officers, it shimmered in silver thread. These symbols marked them not just as soldiers, but as representatives of authority, agents of both order and oppression. And perhaps the most telling mark of all was the cuff band on the left sleeve worn by every Feljond Darmarie member. This brown cuff, 30mm wide, was bordered with grey cotton and inscribed in bold silver-grey Gothic lettering, Feljond Darmarie. It was a badge of power, but by 1945 it had also become a symbol of fear, resentment, and for many impending death. If there was one symbol that made the Feljond Armory instantly recognisable and deeply feared, it was the Ringkragen, often called the duty gorget. This distinctive crescent-shaped metal plate was worn proudly around the neck, suspended by a chain, and it became the hallmark of the German military police. The gorget itself was polished and imposing. At its centre sat a bold, spread-winged eagle clutching a swastika, perched above a scroll that read simply, Feljond Darmarie. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, and the message it conveyed was unmistakable. Authority, order, and control had arrived. But among ordinary German soldiers, this emblem sparked fear and resentment. The Feljond Darmarie weren't seen as brothers in arms. They were enforcers, disciplinarians, and watchdogs. Because of the Gorget's chain and the unit's harsh reputation, frontline troops mockingly called them Kettenhunde, chained dogs. It was a name that stuck, capturing both the appearance and the feared role these men played within the military hierarchy. Despite their intimidating reputation, members of the Feljond Armory were held to an unusually high standard of conduct. They were expected to represent the Wehrmacht's law and order, not just in action, but in character. Their discipline had to be beyond question. Any officer who violated this code, through misconduct, corruption, or abuse of power, could be stripped of his command. In such cases, he would be transferred to the Feljond Armory Replacement Battalion, a sort of holding unit for disgraced personnel, and sent back to his home station in shame. But it wasn't just officers. Any Felgendarm, regardless of rank, who proved unfit for service, whether due to cowardice, brutality, or even incompetence, could be expelled from the unit. Depending on the nature of the offence, they too would be sent to the replacement battalion. From there, their fate would vary. Some might be quietly reassigned to rear echelon duties, while others, especially in the later years of the war, could find themselves sent to penal battalions or frontline punishment units, where survival was anything but guaranteed. Being a Feldgendarm came with power, but also with pressure. The authority to arrest and execute others came with the unspoken understanding that one misstep could destroy your career, or worse. Among the most shadowy and elusive forces within Hitler's war machine was the Geheime Feldpolizei, or Secret Field Police, better known by its initials, GFP. Unlike the more visible and uniformed Feljond Darmarie, the GFP operated from the shadows, acting as the executive arm of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. They were not just police officers, they were spies, interrogators, and hunters operating across enemy lines and within their own. Formed in July 1939, just weeks before the war started, the GFP served as the Army's special investigative branch. Much like the Feljond Armory had been built from experienced civilian police forces, The GFP drew its ranks from seasoned detectives transferred from the Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, Germany's criminal police. These men weren't raw recruits. They were already experts in surveillance, interrogation, and forensic investigations. Though authorized to wear the uniform of an army administration official, most GFP agents operated in civilian clothes, blending in, moving silently, and watching from the shadows. They maintained close ties with the Sicherheitspolizei, or security police, working hand in hand to investigate a wide range of crimes, everything from espionage and treason to black market dealings, murder and theft within the military ranks. In occupied territories like Belgium and France, the GFP took on an even more dangerous role, pursuing underground resistance movements, dismantling sabotage networks, and extracting confessions through methods both legal and unspeakably brutal. They became infamous among resistance fighters, viewed not as mere enforcers, but as ghost-like predators who could appear anywhere and vanish without trace. Typically, a GFP unit was small but formidable, around 50 personnel in total. This included a senior officer, usually holding the rank of major or above, supported by 30 officers ranging from second lieutenant to captain, and a group of auxiliary staff. These units were highly mobile and could be broken up into small detachments, often deploying just 1 or 2 men to oversee vast regions. In some cases, a lone GFP agent might be embedded within a Feljond Armory unit, specifically to assist with anti-partisan operations or sensitive intelligence work. As the war dragged into its second half, the GFP found their mission increasingly turning inward. Morale in the Wehrmacht was crumbling, the tides of war were shifting. More and more German soldiers began to lose faith in victory, and some, especially in France and Russia, deserted to the resistance. The spring of 1944 marked a tipping point. Desertions surged across the German army. In just one army group, Army Group Center, the GFP were searching for over 3,000 missing soldiers suspected of having joined enemy forces or vanished behind enemy lines. In response, the GFP began publishing and circulating wanted lists, naming deserters and traitors. These gazettes were distributed to all military security units and police detachments within the army group. The manhunt never stopped. No one could be sure who might be watching, listening, or following them. By this point in the war, the GFP had become something of a phantom force within the Wehrmacht. They weren't part of the frontline struggle, but their influence reached every trench, every bunker, every occupied village. Soldiers whispered their name with unease, because if the enemy didn't catch you, the GFP might. By 1943, the tide of war was turning against Germany. The string of early victories had given way to bitter defeats, especially on the Eastern Front, where endless Soviet offensives, brutal winters, and staggering losses had shattered the morale of many German soldiers. Desperation began to creep into the ranks, and increasing numbers of able-bodied men looked for any excuse to avoid combat, particularly the nightmare unfolding in the East. The Wehrmacht needed a new solution, something stricter, more fearsome, more absolute. In November 1943, the Army High Command took drastic action. They created an entirely new elite enforcement corps, the Felger Corps. Unlike other military police units, this formation answered only to the highest levels of command. It did not report to field marshals or division leaders. Its loyalty was to the top, and its authority surpassed that of any standard police or even combat officer. The Feldjäger's mission was clear and uncompromising: enforce discipline at all costs. They were tasked with restoring order in chaos, halting panicked retreats, collecting stragglers, rounding up escaped prisoners of war, and above all, hunting deserters. If a soldier was out of position, retreating without orders, or simply suspected of evading the front, the Feldjäger had the power to demand answers, and if they didn't like what they heard, they could act immediately. They didn't need paperwork, they didn't need permission. The Feldjäger could hold a drumhead court-martial, a rapid field trial with no defense, no appeals, and if the verdict was guilty, they could carry out an execution on the spot. No further approval was necessary. This force was organized into 3 regiments, known as Felger Commandos. Felger Commando 1 and 2 were deployed to the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht's discipline was in the most critical condition. Felger Commando 3 remained in the West, where they would later face the Allied invasions of 1944. Each Feldjäger commander held a rank equivalent to an army commander and had the authority to discipline or punish any member of the Wehrmacht or even the Waffen SS. In moments of conflict, when command disputes arose or orders were questioned, the Feldjäger had the terrifying privilege of settling the matter at gunpoint. But this wasn't just a force of enforcers. It was a corps built from combat veterans. Every Feldjäger had to have at least 3 years of frontline experience and had to have earned at least the Iron Cross Second Class, a decoration awarded for bravery in battle. Officers needed to have extensive command experience and a proven record of leadership under fire. These were men who had survived the worst the war had to offer, and now they were being called on to keep the army itself from collapsing. They were hardened, unsympathetic, and absolutely loyal to their mission. No sympathy for weakness, no tolerance for fear. Their mere presence was a warning: fight or face the consequences. The High Command hoped that through sheer fear and unshakable authority, the Feldjäger would become the iron backbone of a crumbling army, a brutal but necessary force designed to ensure that, even as Germany stood on the brink of defeat, its soldiers would fight to the bitter end. While the Feljond Darmarie and the Felger Corps were among the most well-known enforcers within Hitler's military machine, they were far from the only ones. Nazi Germany maintained a vast and complex web of police and security organizations, each with specific duties, and each playing a vital role in the Reich's system of surveillance, control, and repression. One such unit was the Heeresstreifendienst, or Army Patrol Service. This lesser-known branch of the military police was tasked with maintaining discipline and order across the German army. These patrols conducted identification checks, searched for absent or suspicious personnel, and even took on traffic control responsibilities in areas where movement had to be tightly coordinated. Though their powers were more administrative, they had the authority to report violations to commanding officers, often resulting in swift disciplinary actions for soldiers who were found out of place or without proper papers. Then there was the Wehrmachtstreifendienst, which operated in 2 distinct branches, the Bahnhofswache and the Zugwache. These were the soldiers of the German railway system, a critical lifeline for the war effort. The Bahnhofswache patrolled Germany's massive railway stations and hubs. Their job was to screen both soldiers and civilians, check for proper leave documentation, search for deserters, and maintain order within chaotic transport centres. With thousands of troops moving across the Reich every day, this task was as overwhelming as it was essential. The Zugwache, on the other hand, took their role a step further. These army patrols were assigned directly to military trains, especially those moving through dangerous zones or toward active fronts. Not only did they check papers and prevent desertion, they also guarded trains against partisan sabotage, monitored civilian activity in occupied zones, and responded to attacks on rail infrastructure. In a war where mobility and logistics meant everything, these men helped protect the arteries of the German war machine. But beyond the military units stood the civilian police structure, which by the mid-1930s had been completely overhauled and militarized under Nazi rule. In 1936, all civilian police were divided into 2 primary branches, the Ordnungspolizei, or order police, and the Sicherheitspolizei, or security police. The Ordnungspolizei, ORPO, included the Schutzpolizei, who operated in cities, the Gendarmerie, responsible for rural areas, and the Gemeindepolizei, who served smaller towns and villages. Though originally civilian in nature, these forces were militarized over time and became increasingly involved in occupation duties, forced labor roundups, and repression. The Sicherheitspolizei ZIPO, however, was far more sinister. This branch was made up of 2 key organizations: the Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, Germany's criminal investigation police, and the Gestapo, the infamous secret state police. Together, they formed the backbone of Nazi political enforcement. In 1939, both Kripo and Gestapo were absorbed into a new superagency, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or RSHA, the Reich Security Main Office. This massive intelligence and security structure was overseen by Reinhard Heydrich. The RSHA centralized all aspects of surveillance, control, and extermination policies under a single authority. Within the occupied territories, the SIPO and the SD, the SS's own intelligence arm, became the core unit tasked with crushing resistance, gathering intelligence, and executing Nazi racial policies. These officers, many of them handpicked from the Kripo and SD, became the key enforcers in ghettos, towns, and villages across Eastern Europe. In places like Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, it was these units, SD SIPO task forces, often in coordination with the ORPO, that organised mass arrests, deportations, and the maintenance of order in ghettos. They worked hand in hand with the Einsatzgruppen and local collaborators, turning occupied towns into zones of surveillance, terror, and mass murder. The Gestapo, short for Geheime Staatspolizei or Secret State Police, was one of the most feared institutions in Nazi Germany. Often portrayed as an omniscient force with eyes everywhere, the reality was both more mundane and in some ways even more disturbing. Administratively, the Gestapo was placed under the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, an umbrella organization that coordinated the Reich's vast security apparatus. The Gestapo functioned as both an arm of the Sicherheitspolizei, or security police, and a close collaborator with the SD, the SS's own intelligence agency. Together, these forces formed a tangled web of surveillance and repression that reached into every aspect of German life. But far from being a superhuman force, most Gestapo offices were staffed by ordinary bureaucrats, clerks, case handlers, and administrative workers drowning in paperwork. They were not omnipresent agents listening at every door or peering through every window. Instead, they relied heavily on one thing: denunciations by ordinary German citizens. In fact, the Gestapo was often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of accusations pouring in from the public. Neighbours denounced neighbours, colleagues accused one another. Jealousy, revenge, paranoia, and political opportunism fueled a constant stream of tips, many of which were petty, exaggerated, or entirely false. Local Gestapo offices spent the majority of their time simply trying to separate credible threats from personal vendettas, a bureaucratic nightmare that ironically undermined the perception of their total control. And despite the Gestapo's fearsome reputation, the actual manpower behind it was shockingly limited. In Lower Franconia, an area with a population of 1 million, the entire Gestapo presence consisted of just 28 staff members, half of whom were office clerks. In Düsseldorf, which oversaw the densely populated Lower Rhine region with over 4 million people, the Gestapo office had a total staff of 281. These figures reflect a startling truth. The Gestapo maintained its power not through numbers, but through fear, propaganda, and the complicity of the public. The problem only worsened after 1939. As the war intensified, many Gestapo personnel were drafted into the military or transferred to other branches of the Nazi security services. The already understaffed offices became even more overwhelmed. Yet the stream of denunciations kept flowing, even increasing in some regions, forcing the remaining agents to work under impossible conditions. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, meaning Protection Squadron, was more than just a military or police unit. It was the ideological backbone of the Nazi Party, and under the leadership of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, it grew into one of the most powerful and terrifying organizations in the Third Reich. What began as a small group of personal bodyguards for Adolf Hitler eventually evolved into an elite, sprawling apparatus, a state within a state. The SS became Hitler's modern-day Praetorian Guard, fiercely loyal, fanatically ideological, and answerable only to him. It was built not merely on discipline and structure, but on a radical belief system, one that revolved around racial purity, total obedience, and the violent reshaping of society. At the tip of the spear were the Einsatzgruppen, the SS's so-called operational task forces. These mobile killing units were sent into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the wake of the German army's advance. Their primary mission was the suppression of partisan activity and resistance, but in practice, their operations went far beyond the battlefield. The Sicherheitsdienst, known simply as the SD, was the intelligence arm of the SS and the official security service of the Nazi Party. It operated in close parallel with the Gestapo, and the two agencies were often referred to as sister organizations, but the SD had a unique and far-reaching role that made it one of the most important tools of Nazi control. The SD's origins lay within the SS itself, but after the Nazis seized power, it quickly gained influence. As SS officers began to infiltrate top government security posts, the SD's position within the state grew stronger. In 1938, its role was formalized. The SD was designated as the official intelligence agency of both the Nazi Party and the German state. No other body had this dual authority, giving the SD unmatched access to the inner workings of the regime and the country it ruled. Its primary mission was chillingly simple: identify, monitor, and neutralize anyone considered an enemy of National Socialism. To achieve this, the SD built a network of full-time agents backed by thousands of informants, spread across Germany and later throughout the occupied territories. These informants infiltrated workplaces, communities, universities, even churches. The result was a culture of fear, where anyone could be watching and every word spoken might be reported. But unlike the Gestapo, the SD wasn't primarily an enforcement body. Its function was intelligence gathering and analysis. The SD identified targets, mapped out threats, and compiled exhaustive reports that shaped Nazi policies and purges. The Gestapo, and to some extent the Kripo, acted as the executive enforcers, carrying out the arrests, interrogations, and punishments. But the SD often provided the intelligence that guided these actions. This distinction didn't make the SD any less dangerous. In fact, in many ways it was more insidious, a hidden hand pulling the strings behind the scenes. And like so many of the Reich security organizations, the SD ultimately came under the control of Heinrich Himmler, who served as chief of the German police. Through Himmler, both the SD and Gestapo were effectively merged into a single ideological weapon. Only the Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, retained a degree of independence. Having existed long before the Nazis came to power, the Kripo maintained its own internal structure and focused primarily on traditional criminal investigations. But even they were increasingly absorbed into the broader security framework, especially as the RSHA centralized power. By the outbreak of war, the SD had become the eyes and ears of the Nazi regime, a shadow force responsible for identifying threats before they emerged. Their intelligence fed the machine of repression and genocide, and in occupied territories, their reports helped shape the persecution of Jews, communists, and resistance fighters, often directly leading to arrests, deportations, and mass killings. The SD didn't wear fearsome uniforms or carry out public executions, but their work made those things possible. They were the architects of silence, operating in whispers and shadows. And in the world of Nazi Germany, where surveillance replaced trust and ideology crushed truth, they were always listening. Beyond the ranks of specialized police and elite enforcers like the Feljond Armory and Felger Corps, the German army also fielded a different kind of unit, less glamorous, often overlooked, but critical to the day-to-day control of occupied territories. These were the Sicherungsdivisionen, or security divisions, a total of 15 formations tasked with maintaining order behind the front lines. But these were not elite soldiers. In fact, they were quite the opposite. Most men assigned to these divisions were in the lower fitness categories, often older or suffering from minor medical issues that made them unfit for intense frontline combat. Many had once been part of standard infantry divisions, but as the war ground on and Germany's manpower pool thinned, some of these formations were downgraded, stripped of their heavy weapons, and repurposed for rear area duties. Their mission was to secure German supply lines, protect communication hubs, and keep order in the occupied territories. But that task grew increasingly difficult, especially on the Eastern Front, where Soviet partisan resistance became a growing and deadly threat. These security troops were often poorly trained and ill-equipped for the brutal, fast-moving guerrilla warfare they encountered in the forests and villages of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Their older ranks, lack of mobility, and low morale made them ill-suited for hunting elusive partisan fighters. Yet they were expected to hold vast areas of land, defend railroads and bridges, and maintain total control over local populations, a task that would challenge even the most seasoned of divisions. As the war wore on, the situation only worsened. Any fit or capable soldiers within the security divisions were often transferred to frontline combat units, leaving behind those least capable of handling high-stress, combat-intensive situations. What remained was often a skeleton force, underarmed, undersupported, and frequently overwhelmed. Despite this, these divisions played a central role in anti-partisan warfare and were often involved in brutal reprisals, mass arrests, and the execution of civilians suspected of helping resistance fighters. In some areas, they participated in the same cycle of occupation, repression, and terror that characterized Nazi control across Eastern Europe. In theory, they were meant to keep order. In practice, they were a blunt instrument, overstretched, underqualified, and trapped in a war they were never designed to fight. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, much of the Nazi regime's administrative machinery was quickly dismantled. The SS was disbanded, the Gestapo outlawed, and key figures were rounded up for trial. But not all remnants of the old order vanished overnight. Surprisingly, in some parts of the country, particularly in British-occupied zones, former Feljond Armory troops found themselves assigned back into police roles, this time under Allied command. In Schleswig-Holstein, British forces established a regiment of former German military police to maintain discipline and order at the Meldorf Demobilization Center, where thousands of German troops were processed after the war. These men were armed, uniformed, and paid with rations. For many, it was a strange turn of fate, to go from enforcing the will of a tyrannical regime to maintaining order under Allied supervision. But in the chaos of post-war Germany, where structure had collapsed and millions were on the move, even former chain dogs were seen as a temporary solution. Throughout the war, the role of Germany's military police and security services had been complex and often deeply controversial. They were known by many names. To some, they were the Kettenhunde, the chain dogs, feared for their authority and ruthlessness. To others, they were the Heldenklau, the hero snatchers, dreaded for pulling men from the rear and sending them to die at the front. Some wore their duties with discipline and a sense of order, attempting to bring structure to the chaos. Others wielded unchecked power, becoming tools of brutality, operating above the law, and often acting as instruments of terror rather than justice. Many were tried in the subsequent Nuremberg trials, specifically the Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947-48, where commanders like Otto Ohlendorf, responsible for the murder of over 90,000 civilians in Ukraine and the Crimea, were found guilty and executed. Others, like Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, vanished in the chaos of the Reich's final days. His fate remains unknown to this day. Countless lower-level officials melted into the civilian population or fled abroad, aided by rat lines through Italy and Spain, often with the quiet help of sympathetic networks within the Catholic Church or foreign governments more concerned with the coming Cold War than with justice. But many of these men didn't disappear into obscurity, they were recruited. As tensions between the West and the Soviet Union escalated, former SS, Gestapo, and SD officers were suddenly seen not as war criminals, but as assets. Reinhard Gehlen, a Wehrmacht intelligence general who had worked closely with the SS and SD on the Eastern Front, brokered a deal with the Americans. He handed over his vast network of intelligence on the Soviets and was rewarded not with imprisonment but with power, going on to found the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, West Germany's post-war intelligence agency, with full backing from the CIA. Through Project Paperclip and similar covert programs, US and British intelligence agencies quietly absorbed former Nazis into their own ranks. These men provided valuable insights on Soviet tactics, counterinsurgency, and intelligence structures, skills they had refined while brutally suppressing resistance movements across Europe. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who tortured and murdered French resistance members as a Gestapo officer, was protected by American intelligence after the war and later escaped to South America. There, like many others, he lived under a false name until he was finally captured and extradited decades later. And it wasn't just the West. The Soviets too employed former SS and police officers, flipping them into agents and informants, using their knowledge of occupation zones to strengthen their hold over Eastern Europe. What began as a war for survival had evolved into a war of secrets, and in that murky battlefield, the sins of the past were often buried beneath new loyalties and new wars. In the end, the SS security apparatus left behind a legacy that was far more complicated than mere defeat. Some were held accountable, some vanished without a trace, and many re-emerged, rebranded as experts, working within the very governments that had once sworn to destroy them. Their knowledge, methods, and worldview would quietly influence Cold War intelligence operations for decades. The brutal machinery that once enforced Hitler's will behind the front lines did not simply vanish, it adapted, infiltrated, and in many cases, survived. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.